All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going deep on Mobutu Sese Seko.
Ah, Mobutu.
The guy who ruled Zaire, what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo for over 30 years?
Yeah, 32 to be exact. A long time.
A long time. And this time we're mainly using his Wikipedia biography as our source. Should be interesting.
Oh, absolutely. A life like that, ambition, power, truly bizarre stuff.
Bizarre is putting it mildly. But let's start at the beginning.
Sure.
I mean, the guy wasn't always Mobutu Sese Seko.
Right. No, not at all. He started out as Joseph-Désiré Mobutu, born back in 1930, Belgian Congo.
Okay, Joseph-Désiré Mobutu.
And even his early life, it wasn't exactly quiet. His mother, she had to escape this village chief's harem.
Whoa, wait a minute. A harem?
Yeah, it was a forced marriage situation. She ended up in Lisala. That's where she met Mobutu's father, worked as a cook.
So already there's this sense of drama, even before Mobutu's even born.
Oh, for sure. Almost like, foreshadowing his own rise and fall.
Right. Okay, so we've got young Joseph-Désiré. What was he like growing up?
Well, bright kid, really intelligent, but always pushing boundaries, that rebellious type.
I can see that.
Excelled in school, ran the class newspaper, but always getting into trouble. Authority wasn't his thing.
What kind of trouble are we talking?
Oh, enough that he got slapped with 7 years in the force publique.
The what?
That was the Belgian colonial army.
Ah, so that's how he got into the military.
Yeah, ironic, huh? Like the punishment shaped his future.
Wild. So he goes from mischievous kid to the army. What happens then?
Discipline. Found it there. One of his bargeants. Kind of a father figure,
Okay.
But more than that, Mobutu, he was a curious guy. Voracious reader. Borrowed books, newspapers, even on duty. That's how he started, I guess, getting politically aware.
Oh, a forced stint in the army turns into a political awakening.
You could say that. And this is all before he even hits 30, mind you.
This guy doesn't waste time. What's next?
Journalism. While still in the army, he starts writing for Actualités Africaines.
No way. Like undercover journalist?
Pseudonym. Using a different name. Always liked his secrets, Mobutu did.
Okay, so army, reading, now journalism. Where does this all lead?
Well, in '58, he's sent to cover the World Expo in Belgium. That's where he meets Patrice Lumumba.
Ah, Lumumba, key figure in Congo's independence movement, right?
Exactly. And that meeting, that's a real turning point. Mobutu joins Lumumba's Congolese national movement, the MNC.
So he's officially in the political game now, but how does he go from, journalist to Lumumba's right-hand man?
He was sharp, ambitious, and a damn good communicator. People saw that.
I guess those journalism skills came in handy.
Oh, definitely. But also he seemed, more level-headed than some of the others, pragmatic. And that was appealing, especially with everything going on.
Speaking of everything going on, just days after Congo gets independence in 1960, the force public, the army, mutinies, chaos.
Total chaos. And this is where Mobutu steps up. He's key in those negotiations. Shows he can be the calm in the storm.
Making a name for himself.
You got it. Soon after, bam, Chief of Staff of the Army.
Wow, that's a huge jump. But then, of course, we've got the Congo crisis. Things get even more messy.
The Congo crisis, that's a whole story in itself. Secessionist movements, Cold War getting tangled up in it, real high stakes.
And Lumumba, he made a controversial move, right? Turning to the Soviets for help.
Yeah, the Soviets. Right at the peak of the Cold War. That didn't sit well with the West.
Understatement. So what does Mobutu do?
Well, with some quiet backing from the West, he stages a coup, September 1960.
A coup against his own leader.
Lumumba and President Kantavubu, they were locked in a power struggle at this point. Mobutu essentially declares them both neutralized.
Neutralized? I feel like there's more to that story.
Oh, there is. Mobutu hands Lumumba over to his enemies in Katanga, leads to Lumumba's execution in '61.
That's a dark turn. So a bloodless coup for Mobutu, but a very bloody end for Lumumba. This guy, he's not playing around.
No, he's not. And that's how he takes control, the beginning of his long reign.
This is just the start, folks. This is just the start. So this Leopard of Zaire image, it wasn't just about changing names and stuff, was it? I mean, his face was everywhere, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. You couldn't escape it. Portraits everywhere, every office, every building, officials wearing those pins with his face on them.
Crazy.
Called him Father of the Nation, Messiah. It was a whole personality cult thing. Very calculated.
It's kind of scary how some leaders can do that, make people almost worship them. But while Mobutu was busy building up this image, what was actually going on in Zaire? I mean, for the people living there.
Well, the reality was pretty different from the image, that's for sure. Mobutu's projecting this idea of power and wealth, but the economy.
The economy was struggling.
Oh, yeah, big time. Mismanagement, corruption, you name it. It's all right there in the Wikipedia article. Plain as day.
So, classic kleptocracy, right? The Leopard of Zaire living it up while everyone else is struggling.
Yeah, pretty much. Ruled by thieves. Basically, the people in charge, they're just using the country to get rich.
And the biography, it talks about his palace, this lavish place in Babalite, Shopping sprees in Paris, flying on the Concorde, and meanwhile, back in Zaire, things are falling apart.
It's a pretty stark contrast, right? It makes you think, what happens when power goes unchecked like that, all that greed? How can a country actually move forward when the leader's just siphoning off all the wealth?
Good point. But even with all that going on, Mobutu stayed in power for decades. How did he manage that?
Well, he was smart. I'll give him that. He knew how to play the game, especially when it came to foreign policy.
What do you mean?
The Cold War. He was a master at using it to his advantage, got support from the West, even China to some extent.
So he was playing both sides. Wasn't that kind of dangerous?
It was a balancing act, for sure. But he pulled it off, at least for a while. To the West, he was the anti-communist guy, the bulwark against the Soviets in Africa. That's how he got the money, the military support.
Even though he was, let's be honest, a dictator.
Yeah, even though the West, they were so worried about the Soviets that they kind of looked the other way when it came to Mobutu's less than democratic ways.
And what about that space program thing? I read about that. Zaire trying to launch satellites? Sounds kind of crazy.
Oh yeah, the Zairean space program, that was something else. Late 70s, he teams up with this West German company, OTRAC, trying to get into the space race.
Seriously. With all the problems Zaire was facing, he wanted to launch rockets.
It's hard to say what his real motivation was. Some people think it was about image, trying to look modern and advanced. Others say it was just another way to, pocket some cash.
Because the program didn't really go anywhere, right?
Yep, total flop. Just another example of Mobutu being totally out of touch with what was actually happening in his country. Big dreams, but ignoring the basics.
So for a time, Mobutu's system, it worked, sort of. Things were stable, even if it was through repression. And he was good at playing the international game. But things changed, don't there?
Oh, yeah. By the late 80s, early 90s, Mobutu's grip on power, it was starting to slip.
What happened?
A lot of things. But one of the biggest was the end of the Cold War.
Ah, so no more Soviets, no more need for Mobutu as the anti-communist guy?
Exactly. Suddenly, the West wasn't so willing to overlook all the bad stuff. Human rights abuses, the economic mess. The money started drying up, and the pressure for change, it started to grow.
So trouble at home and abroad? Not a good combination.
Nope. And then things get even worse. The economy goes into free fall. Inflation goes crazy. People are getting restless.
Mobutu's got problems everywhere he looks.
You got it. And finally, in 1990, he gives in a little, agrees to a multi-party system, appoints a transitional government.
Was he actually trying to reform things or just trying to hang on to power? Hard to know for sure.
Yeah, who knows what he was really thinking. But one thing's for sure, things were spinning out of control. And then on top of everything else, you have the Rwandan genocide in '94.
Horrible event. How did that affect Zaire?
Well, it led to a huge influx of refugees. Hutus fleeing Rwanda, a lot of them involved in the killings. Eastern Zaire, it becomes incredibly unstable.
A tinderbox.
Exactly. And that's when Mobutu's enemies, they see their chance. This guy, Laurent-Désiré Kabila, he leads a rebellion, mostly Tutsis.
So the genocide plus all the problems Mobutu had created, it all blends together to bring him down.
You could say that. By '97, Kabila's forces, they've got support from Rwanda and Uganda. They're closing in on the capital, Kinshasa. Mobutu, he's sick of cancer at this point. He flees to Morocco. End of an era.
Wow, what a story. He started out as this ambitious young guy, rose to power, ruled for decades, and then it all falls apart. What a legacy. But we're not quite done with Mobutu's story, are we? Man, it's hard to wrap my head around it. Mobutu's impact on Zaire, the DRC, what a mess he left behind.
Yeah, a real mixed bag. He was, no doubt, a shrewd operator, held on to power for over 30 years, but...
But at what cost, right?
Exactly. Corruption, poverty, fear... That's his real legacy.
It's a far cry from the Leopard of Zaire, that whole strongman image he cultivated.
Oh, yeah. A totally different picture behind the scenes. There was a period of stability. You can't deny that. Early on, especially, he stopped the Congo crisis, and the economy, for a bit, it actually did okay.
But that stability, it was built on some pretty dark stuff.
Repression, silencing anyone who disagreed with him, and lining his own pockets while the country suffered.
So those economic gains, they didn't last?
No, not at all. Mismanagement and corruption, they just ate it all up. By the time Mobutu's gone, Zaire's economy is in ruins, and most people are living in poverty.
It's almost Shakespearean, a country with so much potential dragged down by a leader who is basically just a crook.
It's a classic example of what happens when power corrupts, right? But it also tells us something about the struggles a lot of post-colonial African nations went through.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. The Congo, like many others, they get independence right in the middle of the Cold War.
Ooh, right. Superpowers battling it out and these new countries caught in the middle.
Exactly. Trying to find their own way, build stable governments and economies. It wasn't easy.
So Mobutu wasn't just some random dictator. His story is tied to all these bigger global forces.
Absolutely. He was a product of his time, knew how to play the Cold War game, got the West on his side by being the anti-colonist guy. Didn't matter what he was doing back home.
It makes you realize history is never simple, is it?
Yep. And it shows how connected everything is. What happens in one place can be affected by what's going on halfway across the world.
Okay, so looking back at Mobutu's whole life, his rule, what are the big lessons here?
I think one is the importance of institutions. Strong, independent institutions. Rule of law. Mobutu was able to do what he did because he basically destroyed those things. Took all the power for himself.
So no checks and balances, no one to hold him back.
Exactly. And that's how you get corruption, abuse of power.
It's also a reminder of how important a free press is. Mobutu, he controlled the media, used it to spread his own message, silence anyone who challenged him.
You need a free press to keep those in power honest, to let people know what's really going on.
Makes you appreciate how fragile democracy is, right? We have to constantly protect those things that keep us free.
Couldn't agree more. And those lessons, they're not just history. Look around the world today. You see leaders undermining democracy, silencing critics, enriching themselves. It's still happening.
It's kind of depressing, honestly.
Yeah, it's worrying. Mobutu's story, it's a wake-up call. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely. We have to be vigilant, make sure our leaders are accountable.
Well said. So we started this deep dive asking who was Mobutu, and it seems like the answer is, well, complicated. He was smart, charming, but also brutal, greedy.
A real contradiction. A product of his time, but also someone who made choices that had a devastating impact on his country.
And his story's still relevant today. It helps us understand the Congo's current challenges, and it reminds us of the things we need to fight for to make a better world.
Exactly. It's never just about the past, right?
Well, thank you for taking us on this journey. I think we all learned a lot about Mobutu, Zaire, and really about ourselves.
It was my pleasure. Hopefully it makes people think, dig deeper, have those tough conversations about what's going on in the world.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the life of Mobutu Sese Seko. It's been a wild ride, full of intrigue, tragedy, and ultimately, I think, hope. Hope that by understanding the past, we can create a better future. Torisi S ni